Welcome to our sixth session on Armenian art and architecture. Last week, we looked at Islamic art, or I better said, the Armenian art church architectures in the age of Islam. Today, we will look at the Bagratuni clan, who proved to be both politically astute and puissant qualities that together allowed them to take over large swaths of Armenian territory and ultimately to force the recognition by the caliphate of an independent Armenian kingdom. The clan had a branch in the eastern province of Sunik, and its Georgian branch continued to govern the northern regions until the 19th century. The great monastic complexes of Hakhbat and Sanahin, which we looked at last week, looking at it a bit later in the period, today much closer to its time, as well as the cathedral in Ani and the churches at Horomos, are typical of Bagratuni architecture, while in Sunik, the Church of Peter and Paul at Datev, the complex on the island of Lake Sevan, and Vahanabank showcase the prowess of the Bagratid builders in that region. So we will look at many photos of beautiful churches today and look at that impact and influence and contrasted with what we would see with the Artsrunis in the Lake Van region in a subsequent lecture in a couple of weeks. So with that, Dr. Roberta Ervine will start us off with the lecture on Bagratuni's builders in the home kingdom in Sunik.
All right, that should bring us up something to look at. So as Ani said, this becomes a very complicated time period. Becomes complicated politically, becomes complicated as well architecturally, as people begin to make exceptional use of the flexibility of architecture as an expressive medium, something that speaks beyond written or spoken words. As we heard last week, the arrival of Islam in Armenia was a real game changer, very literally. It took a carefully ordered, well-planned, everyone was used to the setup, political chessboard, and it turned it upside down and shook it, rearranging everything that people thought they knew about how to live life in the configuration that they were used to. What had been a known landscape, dominated by the very predictable, long-standing rivalries of just a few clans that were positioning themselves between the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, was gone. The Persian Empire was no more, simply dragged away off the board, destabilizing everything. And yet destabilization is not in and of itself a bad thing, at least not for everyone. The clans who had been in the orbit of Persia were hung out to dry in their mountainous regions, so for them it wasn't such a good thing, but overall, it was, because clan heads, hierarchs, everyone had to rethink how to situate themselves on a new map. They had to stop resting on the laurels that they had acquired over centuries. On the one side of the new equation, the choice that they had to make, stood the Armenians' old familiar frenemy, Christian Byzantium, glittering, golden, ancient, and maybe at this point in time, just a little bit tired and worn out, a little ragged around the edges, although it didn't really show yet. The Armenians had a long-standing relationship, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes worse, sometimes extraordinarily wonderful. And they had significant cultural overlap with Byzantium. On the other hand, they were also unfortunately used to the Byzantines taxing them onerously and pressuring them on a regular basis to bring their indigenous church under the control of the Byzantine Patriarchate. A compromise that some might have been willing to make, but the majority were not. So that's one option, to align oneself with the old, the tried, the true, even if sometimes the testy. On the other side of the choice equation stood Islam, an unknown entity with a newly forming government structure, an entity that might or might not play a lasting role in the region, no one could tell. And in addition to its uncertainty, it also had no cultural overlap with Armenia in the early stages. However, also in the early stages, it showed no inclination to tax the Armenians overmuch or to force them to change religiously. Obviously, that would later not be the case. And so here in this transitional period, like transitional periods anywhere, as we look at how Armenians reacted to this set of choices, we find that there were in Armenia both cautious, conventional individuals and clans, and there were the risk takers. And perhaps not surprisingly, the amount of risk that a lower status clan might be willing to take depended somewhat on their geography. So for the clans that had been somewhat overlooked up to this point, like the Rushtunis around Lake Van, and later the Ardzrunis as well, looked at their geographical location in the south of the country and saw immediately the potential benefits for them of allying themselves with a power like Islam that was looking to come into the Armenian sphere, to have access to the Armenian highlands, primarily from the south. By contrast, the ancient and prestigious clans like the Mamigonians, whose lands on the west, Daik, Duruperan, actually straddled the Byzantine border and sometimes fell completely within it. That clan in particular, and others like it, would take a very conservative stance, much less willing to trust their fate to the untried hands of an Islamic caliphate. They would take a much more conservative position, favoring the status quo that they had known up until this point with the empire of the Christians. People, on the other hand, in what had been the Persian border areas out in the east, like the clan of Sinik, would try to wait it out, see what happened in their impregnable mountain fortresses. Geography favored their protection. How long would it take for the Islamic power to manifest its durability or lack thereof? And then there are the people with whom we are primarily concerned this evening, the Bagratuni clan, locked in the center of the Armenian lands, who will have to play both sides and will have to find a way to play both sides without veering to one side or the other. What is the neutral path? What is the least offensive path? What is the most effective way to maintain Armenian authority within these territories? they were able to play this game quite successfully. As we can see from this map that shows the layout of Armenia under Islamic domination 150 years after the invasion, when it was obvious that Islam was there for the long term. As you can see, 150 years on, there are enclaves within the dark yellow Armenian territory that are actual emirates. Islamic populations that have moved into the region, settled, and become self-governing units. So the Bagratids will come out the winner, in part because of their willingness to balance between the two without belonging to either one, and to the fact that they had enough children to pull this off. The Bagratid homeland was in the province of Bagratid, a region that's now in the Turkish province of Agri. You can see it out there in the red on the far right of the screen. You can see how close it is to the contemporary border. And in fact, it's simply there on the western side of Mount Ararat. So Ararat is what stands between the Armenians and the Turks at this particular point. And if you were simply to look at this, it might be difficult to know whether you were looking at it from the Armenian side and the slide was just flipped. So you're seeing the peaks in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's.
So it's a very fertile, but also a very arid province. The regional center was at a place called Bhagavan. All of these Bag names have to do with God. So the Bagaratuni are connected to God. They actually literally connected themselves to God by tracing their lineage back to the Virgin Mary, and beyond her to King David. So they managed to hit all the bases.
This is a series on theology and architecture. And I took to kill the volume on it.
We could mute him if you were going to. Thank you. I thought for a minute we had a comment there, but apparently not directed to us. Okay. So the regional center for the Bagratids is in Bhagavan. Interesting because it's a locus of pre-Christian Armenian worship that Saint Gregory specifically targeted in his evangelization project. And he built there the Church of John the Baptist, which you see in the picture here, in order to counter the presence of an eternal flame at that spot and other things, but an eternal flame dedicated to Ahura Mazda, or Aramazda as he's called in Armenian. The church didn't look, when Gregory built it, like what it looks like here. This church was upgraded from the smaller Gregory church in the 7th century before the Islamic invasions. And you can see from its shape, you think back a couple of classes, that it's one of those ancient basilicas that was surmounted later as kind of an afterthought by a dome, while retaining its ancient basilical structure. Since this is what the church looks like today, it's very fortunate that we have photographs that were taken of it. So I'll share a couple of those with you in addition to the one we just saw. The apse end of the church. You can see that it has some of the qualities that we saw at little places like Pemsashen, with a very simple band of adornment around the edges, kind of accentuating the stair steps up to the dome. This has been colorized quite nicely by someone. You can see the door end of the church, the western end of the church, as it once appeared. And then there is a collage of photographs that has been posted by someone on Facebook, collecting everything that they could find by way of photographic record of the church. And so you can see both ends of the church. You can see the window in the apse. You can see some of the decoration over the windows and then over the lintel where there was also an inscription. Another church that was built just prior to the Islamic invasions was the Church of St. Theodoros in Bagaran. The same general area, and obviously within the land of the Bagaratuni, but on the Armenian side of the plateau. Actually, no, it's the next one that's on the Armenian side. Have a look at it. This is the landscape. And keep it in mind because later we're going to move Bagratids over into Sunik, which is a very different landscape. This is also just partly an advertisement for a website that I like very much. Map Hill will let you zoom into these places, give you topographical views of what they all looked like. And you can see that the Bagratid lands include a massive plateau. Here's another view of it. You have mountains upon mountains. Plateaus over flat valleys. This area functioned as the capital city of the Bagratids, beginning in around 885. Here's a picture of what the village looked like about 100 years ago, when it was still an Armenian village. Here's what there is today, a much smaller location, primarily inhabited by Kurds, some of them, interestingly, with Armenian blood mixed in to their genetics. This is an aerial view of the Church of St. Theodoros. When you look at it, what you primarily notice is the actual absence of a structure. This church as well was destroyed in the middle of the last century. But as you walk out towards the spot on which it once stood, that level kind of white area in the background, you will find remaining bits of structures around it. So the cleanup of the site, thankfully, has not been perfect. And not only are there small things and little bits of outlines of where buildings once stood, there are also things like this, which seems to have been a khachkar, the stem at the bottom of it for insertion in the ground. And there is still quite incontrovertible evidence of the presence of Armenian Christians. This evidence is found both on the ground. Here you have I put up the link to the blog site. I wasn't able to embed it, but it's a really interesting blog by an Indian Armenian who went out and had a look at this area. Spoke to this young boy who knew that he was partly Armenian and had him show him around. Other evidences of Armenian presence at this site are visible in buildings in the town, where you can see decorative and inscribed stones have been used as part of a building project, a more domestic building project. Something for which one does not entirely blame people. Stone is expensive. So you reuse what you can. And for us, even things like this, small as they are important. Once again, we are fortunate to have older photographs of what once stood on the spot of St. Theodoros as it used to be. Unlike Surpovanes, which we saw before, a basilica that had a dome retrofitted to it, St. Theodoros was built originally as a square church from the beginning. With the same types of bands of very simple decoration around it, built as a 4-apsed cross plan, cruciform plan. And there are things within it that we will see again in other parts of the country. You see the double archway over the altar, the lower arch being rounder than the upper one. And you see the very tall, almost like blind arches to either side of the main altar, as opposed to enclosed simple chapels. And the floor plan created an 8-sided star structure. It's not the first time that we've seen it. We're going to be seeing it a lot more. Reminding the people standing within it of the 8 days, the 7 ages of creation as we know it, and the 8th day that will lie beyond it. Supported on the 4 internal points, whether you think of them as compass points, elements, earth, air, fire, water type elements, whether you think of them as the 4 gospel writers, your choice. Supporting the dome / the light / perhaps, as some people have suggested, a reminiscence of the very simple square structure of a Zoroastrian fire temple. Whatever it was, whatever form of reasoning or theological overlay we want to put on these, it's very interesting to see that this plan turns up in place. And you have to ask yourself, which one comes first? Which one? Who's influencing whom? What is going on with this? On the left, you have the floor plan of Etchmiadzin, as it was restored in this time period from its original simple basilica into a shape like this. In the middle is St. Theodoros. And then on the right is this church far away from the Armenian homelands, the Church of Saint-Géorgny-de-Prés, which incorporates into it the same structure as part of a larger plan. And that by itself might not be quite so striking, except that it was built in the early 19th century by an architect whose name was Eudes. Sorry to anybody named Eudes who I'm mispronouncing out there, aka Odo of Metz. And what's interesting about the fact that it's built by him is that he's known to have been the first Christian architect born north of the Alps. And he was of Armenian origin. So you have to think, aha, maybe there's a bridge there for this structure to cross, literally to cross into Europe. And here is the church that he built, and you can see the 4 apses of it are very prominent, at least the 2 that we can see. It's also worth noting that while Bagratid princes certainly built churches, and we could look at any number of them, we had endless time to do it, a very striking number of Bagratid churches were built by their women. Bagratid women were renowned as hands-on patrons of architecture. And in fact, Bagratid women were one of the clan's very best tools in executing their plan for unification of the Armenian highlands and dominance of the Armenian highlands, why not, in this time period. So we're going to look at some of these Bagratid women, women who built structures that reflected what they wanted to say, and presumably also what their husbands would have wanted to say, their family would have wanted to say, about Armenian Christianity in the early days of domination by Islam.
What period is this?
We're going to be doing 8th to early 10th. Well, maybe a little later 10th even. One of the places that Bagratid women featured in the landscape was Syunik. Syunik, which was trying to sit out the development of the Islamic power in the region, biding its time to see what might happen. Syunik was a vast region in this time period. Everything on the screen that's in any kind of green except the background is Syunik. It was a large enough territory that it had been coveted in the 5th century by the Mamigonians, who likewise had hopes of dominating and directing Armenian political life, in their case of unifying it more with the Byzantine program. It did not work in their case. As you can see here, Syunik actually wraps its arms around Lake Sevan. It also embraced areas that are now in Iran. And it contained as well a substantial portion of Artsakh. As the map indicates, this is not a totally unified, uniform, monolithic province. Syunik was well known for allowing reasonable amounts of independence to princes whose families had owned territory within it for ages. And the joy and the trouble of the Syunetsi princes was to try to keep these people reasonably unified, reasonably on board with what was going on, and maintain friendly relationships with all of them. So this patchwork of semi-independent, well, you can see why they're semi-independent. This is not a landscape that lends itself to unification. And you can see why also the Syunetsis went for a policy of isolation whenever possible, because it works out there. This kind of a landscape was quite a change for a princess coming from the much more arid Anatolian plateau to this deeply green, abundantly watered landscape that abounds today as it did then, with moody landscapes and unique animals. There's a donkey with character. But in addition, there are animals that are unique to this area. Syunik was also important linguistically, not simply in terms of its land, its fauna, and its very early Christian history. But when Stepanos of Syunik in the 8th century wrote his commentary on grammar, he said that it is important to know all the regional dialects of one's own language, by which he meant Armenian. One should know the dialects of Ispir, whatever that was, and Syunik and Artsakh, in addition to classical Armenian, both middle and central. So to be able to do grammar in Armenian, according to him, it's beneficial to know at least 5 dialects of Armenian. So those of us who are dealing with the difference between Eastern and Western are vastly outclassed by 8th century Armenian grammarians. Okay, so the princess we're going to talk about who came into this landscape from the arid West was Mariam Bagratuni. She was the next to youngest of the future king Ashot I Bagratuni's 7 children. So she had 6 siblings. She came to Syunik in order to marry Prince Vasak Gabur. The times were dangerous. It was a very bad moment in Armeno-Islamic relations at this second. Just 20 years before Mariam arrived there, in the generation of her husband's parents, Syunik had been invaded by the legendary Islamic general Buha the Great, known for his ferocity. His name was the name that parents in the area used to frighten their children. If you don't do what I tell you, Buha's gonna get you. I'll feed you to Buha, or whatever variation of it was. And Mariam's husband-to-be at that point, had just been named as prince of the region because others who might have held that position were in captivity. So it seems quite likely that he had never intended to become prince. Nonetheless, history foisted it upon him, and thus also upon her. And together, the 2 of them had 3 sons, an ideal Armenian family. However, as luck would have it, as fate would have it, as the will of the divine would have it, Vasak died when the children were still small, and she was widowed young. And in her spiritual devastation at the change in her life, she made a vow, according to tradition, that in her husband's memory, she would build 30, or some say 40, churches. The woman is a builder. And knowing her desire to devote her life, her power, her fortune to God and to the memory of her late husband, a certain monk, later to become Katologos, a man named Mashtot Yerevardetsi, suggested to her that she should take on a project in the interest of getting to these 30 or 40 churches. She should move to the northern end of her territory and transformed the small 4th century structure that stood on an island in Lake Sevan into a real monastic center. Now we know today Sevan is no longer an island. It's a peninsula that juts out into the water of the lake. Today we know it as home to the Vazgenyan Gemaran, the 2nd seminary of the Echmiadzin Katolikosate. We also know it as home to the Soviet-era writer's house, which kind of shelters under a lip of the island. I believe that's now a hotel. So Mariam took this on, the obvious beauty of this location inspired her, despite the challenge of bringing materials and workmen to an island location. And she was inspired while she was at it to build not 1, but 2 churches on Sevan. And you can see them in this aerial view. The larger one on the left of this picture, dedicated to the Holy Apostles, and the smaller one on the right, you can see close up here on the left. I know it's a little dizzying to turn around like that. To the Holy Mother of God. And from the air, as you go up, you can see the outline of the buildings that once joined those 2 churches into a monastic complex. And over time, these have been excavated more, made more clear. So you really have an idea of the size of community that she was supporting on this island. When the buildings were completed in 874, her father came to visit and see what she had been up to and congratulate her on her achievement. And in celebration of what she had done, he endowed her institution with the income from land in his own territory. He didn't endow it with money from lands in her territory. He made a gift. And today, the configuration of buildings on Sevan has changed just a bit, but her presence is still seen and felt there. I'm assuming that many of you on this call have been to Sevan and have enjoyed its spectacular atmosphere and scenery, and you can thank her for that. Pilgrims are shown a small cell attached to the Holy Apostles' Church. You can see it here on the left of the church. Has a small door in it. It's attached to the transept of the church. And when she was present on the island, she was said to have stayed here, living an ascetic life. And from the privacy of her cell, she could both hear and possibly also see the liturgy that was being performed inside the church. Obviously, the church is still very much in use today. Pilgrims come to it from all over the world, as well as the community of seminarians on the peninsula. For most normal people, this would be a sufficient accomplishment for one's lifetime. However, at the same time that Mariam had the churches on Sevan going up, making it possible for a community to grow there and to maintain itself until today. Mariam was also involved in a long-term building project at another location, a monastery called Shohaka. Shohakavank took her 11 years. And she put heart and soul and budget into it. She paid 10,000, which I guess in our money might be 10 million, to the Muslim owners of the land that she wanted it to sit on. A lordly amount of money. She must have loved the location. Not counting what she would invest in the buildings. Although Shohaka-Vank remained in use until the 17th century, which is not a bad run for a 9th century building, now the very scanty remains of her beautiful monastery are embedded within a village, Sorakyukh, whose houses and a mechanic's shop, as I found out, back right up to it, making it very unlikely that this site will be excavated. You can see the buildings in the background, how close they are. And in fact, we had to walk through the yard of a home in order to get there. Of all her foundations, this was Mariam's favorite. The walls of a building beside the church remain. So there was some kind of maybe something like a kavit, who knows, attached to it. I haven't seen any studies of this building. I would love to know if there are some. The backside of one section of the church, the altar apse, the apse of a side chapel. This is the southern side chapel, that still remains. As do parts of the entrance, monumental entrance, which, as you can see, now shelters part of a cemetery. A modern grave stands there within the archway. The view from this hill is quite lovely, but it's not exactly the most gorgeous view of Lake Sevan anywhere. We're going the wrong way here. I would like to go the other way. Yes, all right. But it's very peaceful. Even with a village there, it's very peaceful. And somewhere beneath these paltry remains, Mariam herself is buried. I would love to know where. We spent the better part of a day figuring out where this place was just to be able to visit her. There's no sign of her at all, other than the atmosphere in the place.
Did you learn why this place was important for her in particular, as opposed to the great
She just
beauty of
loved it.
Sevan?
And so, which means the woman must have toured around the lake, looking for places that she wanted to build something on. Looking for exactly that right spot.
And by 877, Muslims already owned that property.
Oh, yes. So they're intertwined now with the life of people in Syunik and with Karakunik, what's now the province of Karakunik. So it's interesting to see to what extent she, like other Bagratid builders, avoided Islamic elements in her architecture. She was not interested at this point in time in seeing what kind of commonality there might be between her Christianity and the religion of her invaders. That would come at a later time, but not in this time. What she created are a variety, and others together with her, a variety of traditional Armenian forms. You will not find, to my knowledge, anything outside of those forms in this time period. So it's making a statement in and of itself. Islam is here. We must deal with it politically. We will not deal with it religiously. We will not incorporate it. We are not interested yet in cohabiting. Coexisting, we may have to do. Compromise, no, not really. So with her energy level, it's very easy to understand why her brother, who became King Sabat I, appointed her to run his building programs. Keep her busy. And he asked her to center herself at Ervine. By this time, she's aging. But this monastery, she and one of her other brothers, Shabu Swarabed, built on the southern shore of Lake Sevan. When you approach this monastery from the road, beautiful, right? And you look at the lovely landscaping around it. You walk around in here, there are kids out playing, there are apple trees, you can pick apples and sit there and eat them. It's just very lovely. You don't immediately grasp how odd a construction this is. But when you come around to the front of it and you look at it face on, it's clear that something has happened here. You obviously have two churches, very similar to one another, except that the dome on the right-hand church is gone. They're pretty much the same size, same shape, same construction material. And then there's this weird little thing in between them. The church on the left is named for St. Gregory. I don't know the name of the church on the right. And that awkward little building in between them is not her fault. It's a kavit from a later date. And it serves as the kavit to both churches, so presumably there was a limited budget, because otherwise you would put a kavit on the front of each. Interestingly, completely different from what she did on Sevan, or as far as we know, at Cholaka. Ervine is built almost flat against the cliff. And if we look at it, you can see how close it is. If we look at it from a slightly different angle, we can see that there is a little bit of room behind it, enough room for a person to pass. Here you get a better view of it. See the pathway going behind the church. But there's really not much more space than that. Walking behind this church, I could touch the cliff with one arm and the church with the other. And in that cliff face is the opening to a cave. So in a way, the church protects the cave. It's an opening to a cave that is the beginning of a passageway that comes out at the top of the cliff. Very handy thing to have if the neighbors are not friendly. And the man who took this picture was fortunate enough to be at the location on a day when there was a group of school kids having a picnic. And they offered to show him because, of course, they knew and they were very excited about getting to share it with someone. Hence, I now have a picture of it, which otherwise would not have. So if we go back to the front of the complex, into that, to me, annoying little cubby, we can see actually how it was patched into the church. Not the greatest job ever. And when you go into the cubby space, which you have to do now to get into the church, you find yourself in a kind of cemetery. Now, this is true of other churches with caveats as well. Unfortunately, the inscriptions on these stones are really worn. And time overall has not been kind to this little caveat. When you go into it, well, I don't have to tell you, you can just look at it yourself. You can see that at one time it was a symmetrical kind of space. Now it has this huge chachkar which has been brought into it in order to keep it safe. It is a gorgeous chachkar, actually. And then in the middle, straight ahead, there's this doorway that leads into what is now a storage room for building materials. So hopefully that means repairs are happening.
I was there this summer. I remember seeing a new altar,
Fantastic. This is good. Yeah, this is excellent.
like new Alvan too,
Very good.
kind of.
Excellent. We hope they keep going. We hope that they are able to acquire a budget and workers to pick this thing back up to its original state. On the right is a doorway that leads into the smaller church, which is still derelict as far as I know. This picture is from 2 years ago. And if we turn back into the caveat and look to our left, we see in front of us the door to the larger church, the St. Gregory Church, which is still very much in use. And I'm glad to hear Gatto say that it's also being upgraded. And if we go through that door, we can then look back into the caveat from which we entered. So you have a little bit of light that comes into it from the caveat. The church's central dome was restored in the 10th century, about 100 years after Mariam and her brother built it. And you can see that it has the 4 windows we've come to expect in a centrally domed square Armenian church. And it maintains that pattern of 4 rounded apses abutting one another, so joining together in a way that creates the pillars that support the dome over the center of the space. In this church, the altar apse is a little bit unusual. Actually, this blocks part of that view that I want. Anyway, there is a double window behind the altar, which usually would be considered as a sign of Chalcedonian confession, the 2 natures of Christ. But whether it is or whether it isn't is questionable, because in this case, directly above the double window is a single one. So it may be the idea of 2 in 1 or 1 in 2, who knows? In any case, it is a bit unusual. And above the south side chapel doorway, there's a very magnificent, well-preserved, long, layered inscription. Which again, I have not seen a transcription of this inscription. If you know of one, I would love to be told about it. Here it is from the opposite side. I think with a magnifying glass and some patience, this could be read. Anyone would like to do that? Happy to share the pictures. So Mariam was based here at Vanevan, it seems, in her older years. And although one would think that the woman had earned a quiet retirement, it was not to be. In the midst of her planning for her next projects, she found herself forced to flee a new wave of Islamic invaders into the area. And together with her sons, who at this point were grown men, she fled to Sevan. The island was safer. But it turned out it was not safe enough. When the invaders also overran the island, she and her sons fled at night by boat across the lake to a more inaccessible part of the mainland. And there, whether it was from stress or whether she became ill or what it was, she died. And her sons could not bear the thought of leaving her there. They couldn't bear the thought of laying her to rest anywhere other than in one of her buildings. And so they embalmed her body and preserved it until they were able to take her back to Shawagabank and lay her to rest there. As we said, this is an active church. I don't know if this is the priest of the parish or if this is a visiting priest, but in any case, a service is underway. The old graffiti are joined by new pictures. And there are a modest number of khachkars scattered around the church. Whether they were there originally or whether they've been moved there from somewhere else, I do not know. But they're very interesting in their designs. Being a Bagratid woman was no easy task. It was not for the faint of heart to belong to this clan. It was no sinecure being married to one of these guys or being the daughter of one of them married to someone else. Khosrovanush, the wife of King Ashot the Merciful or the Generous, depending on how you want to translate Bohormaz, who reigned as head of the kingdom from 953 to 977, had firsthand experience of the difficulties of being a Bagratid woman. She and her husband had 3 sons, which you would think is an ideal situation. Their names were Gagi, Gurgen, and Sambat. Actually, I should have put them in chronological order. Sambat's the oldest, Gagik is the middle, and Gurgen is the baby. And it seems that in the all too familiar pattern of Bagratid men, they didn't get along. We could go with our endless stories about Bagratid sons not getting along. Some of them are funny only in retrospect. That must have been quite tragic to live during these times. Anyway, now that you're there, about 14 years into her husband's reign, Khosrovanush could see the handwriting on the wall with these boys' character. You know, one could speculate that Ashot Bohormaz was a bit of a softie on his boys, perhaps. She took matters into her own hands and did something about it. The oldest of her sons, Sambat, would clearly inherit his father's throne. It was already clear, too, that the youngest one, Gurgen, would become the semi-independent king of the lesser territory of Lori. Leaving Gagik, the middle son, out of the equation. Now, whether that was because he was not problematic, it was the issues the other two had, it's possible, or whether he was just going to be held in safekeeping as what we have recently learned to call the spare. Whatever it was, in order to preempt trouble between her eldest and her youngest, Khosrovanush built the Church of the All Savior, Church of the Redeemer, Amenapurgich, in Lori, which would be the territory of her youngest son. She built it in what would become the monastic complex of Sanahin, one of the great centers of conservative Armenian learning in later centuries, and would have, I think, at peak a brotherhood of some 500 people. Here's a plan of the final complex, just so we can orient ourselves a little bit before we start looking at structures. You can see that there are two churches and then two large kind of open spaces. The smaller of the two churches, with the number 1 in the middle of it, is the Church of the Mother of God, Subastvazazim. It was already on the premises. It had been built a generation before Khosrovanush's time by King Abbas I Bagratid. It is a fully conventional Armenian basilical church. Khosrovanush's church is number 3 on that plan. And as you can see, her church is much, much larger. I think because it was built as a prayer for a much larger life and death issue for the kingdom. And you can see that the two churches, the small one and the large one, are joined by what looks like a walkway or a library. You can see niches in there for books, perhaps, or a scriptorium, or a gemaran. It's traditionally known as the gemaran of Grigor Magistros, who would live slightly after this time. And those two huge open spaces are kavits that were added later. So here you can see the truncated dome of one kavit. They're not really germane to what we're doing, but they are beautiful, and it's nice to have a look at them. Anyway, they were large enough. Here you can see the interior of one of them. They were large enough, this is the same one looking outward, to accommodate a congregation. Something which, as the conservative theology of the Lori region continued to develop, became necessary, as for a certain period of time, the faithful were excluded from the service. If you want to know more about that, you can ask Bishop Daniel. He did a whole study of the structure of kavits and their chronology and what they were built for and so on. But we're going to look at these just a little bit because it's a side note, it's a footnote, but still, in one of the kavits, on one of the pillars, there is the inscription of a later woman builder, Princess Rusudan. So the tradition of female building in this area continued. But back to what we're mainly concerned with. Now, to get into the churches, you have to go in through the kavit. And once we do, you can see the door of the church ahead. Find yourself in the very conservative sanctuary of the Holy Mother of God first, the smaller one, the earlier church. And you can see that its side chapels are very tall, again, serving almost like blind arches inside space. And you notice that the altar is housed by a double archway. You have the lower rounded arch supporting the more pointed one above it, which in turn is also supporting that dome. And so you have two layers at work there. And you see the window in this one is perfectly normal. You have one window there. By contrast, Khosrovanush's much bigger church, look at the difference between these. It's much larger. The side chapels, on the other hand, are much smaller. The emphasis is not on their supporting role to the main altar. This is not, as in the previous instance, a kind of reminiscence of the three crosses on Golgotha. Here, everything is moving upward. Through the single window, again, comes the light onto the high bima. This altar no longer needs or has that lower rounded supporting arch. The intention of this altar is to soar upward to the peak of an arch with a fourfold band, not only creating clustered columns, something that we will see later in this session, but also reminding us again of the four elements that constitute the world that is included within the church beneath the light. And the height is the emphasis. This is not totally normal for an Armenian church. Armenian churches tend to be more intimate. They tend to be more cozy. They tend to be more the size and the size literally of the congregation. So there's a closeness to God that's expressed in most Armenian churches. This one, not so much. Why would that be? It's a very interesting question. And we're going to add to this question one more thing, which is when you look at the outside of the church, here you can see the contrast between the sizes of the two churches very clearly. Khosrovanush's is on the left, King Abbas's is on the right. And we're ignoring the kavit that's in the right, far right, with the little chapel attached to it. So just the difference in ethos, the difference in intention of those two churches is probably the most interesting developmental characteristic, in my opinion, of this time period. The desire to go bigger, the desire to go taller, in contradistinction to the established norm of a smaller enclosed space. In addition, when we look at the outside of this church,
Just exit out here.
go away, there. When we look at the outside of this church, we also notice something. It doesn't go all the way around the church. It's just on one wall, as far as I remember, of this church. See another somewhat unusual for its time pattern. The arches on this church, these little pilaster columns and the little fake arches above them, really don't, as far as I know, play any structural part in this building. However, they do create a feeling of upwardness, adding to the feeling of upwardness that's already present on the inside of the space. You know before you go into the church that that's what you're going to be experiencing, is this upward movement. And they're very graceful. It's like if you were to take out some of the stones between them, you would have an arcade. You can imagine it being light and airy.
Are the arches behind the altar? They're not.
Well, yes,
They
they
are.
are behind the altar in this case.
And were the placements of windows in the eastern Chevet functional in any way, or?
The one that we're looking at?
Father got up, but is it the windows we're looking at or the one earlier?
I questioned the earlier one,
The earlier one.
This one or the one previous?
the previous. That
This
one,
one?
That one.
yes.
Yes, they do have a function. They are, and like with most Armenian churches, and even more so in later Armenian churches, there was a study made of the way that light moved in this space or would move across this space over the year. So that I noticed this clearly in the church in Jerusalem, the St. James Cathedral, but it's also true elsewhere. So that at different seasons of the year, the light is going to hit a different place on the inside of the church. And so people would move the lecterns that the choir uses accordingly. So the choir will always stand in the light. Hence you want to have your stuff movable so that you can take advantage of that. And it would highlight different things on the walls, different sections of the Adyan.
And also, another question regarding the western entrance and windows above the western doors, almost mimicking the eastern chevet. In
Yes.
some churches, was that a matter of just allowing light to enter the church, or did it have a theological
I
symbolism?
think it also had a theological significance, and it's a great question. I think it also had a theological significance. As you're coming into the church, what you see is what's above the altar in terms of windows, light, and so on, and of course, decoration. As you're exiting the church and going back into the world, you notice the exact same thing, and you will take it with you. You're not leaving it behind you at the altar, you're taking it with you into the external world.
Exactly. Very good. Thank you.
Apparently, Khosrow Anush's prayers were successful. Her building was accepted. When Sambat became king, he confirmed Sanahin as the seat of the bishop of his brother Gurgen's new kingdom. And Sanahin went on to become, together with its silver cousin Halbat across the ravine, which was also built by Khosrow Anush 10 years later. She built one church at it. Also for her sons. So it's almost as if she wanted to make sure that everything was evenly distributed. Gurgen, the young son, got the gold monastery of Sanahin. His older brother Sambat, who would get the kingdom, got the silver monastery at Halbat. But she dedicated both churches to both sons. And we may come back to talk about Halbat when we have a session on fresco churches. So let's look at one more of these Bagratid women builders. The last one that we will look at is named Kataranide.
And before that, if I may ask,
Sure.
could the heights of the cathedrals be influenced, or the structures of the Armenian church be influenced by Catholic cathedrals
Not
at
by
this
this
point?
time.
And how about the Byzantium? Because we already see that in
It's possible.
by Byzantium. Okay,
It's possible. I don't know.
we don't have
But it's
that kind of,
unusual
it is
in the Armenian scene.
because just even across in Hakhbat, we don't have that kind of grand.
We don't have it. So why she chose that for this church, I'm not sure, but we will see it again shortly.
Excellent.
Kataranide was Khosrow Anush's daughter-in-law. She was the only daughter, I think the only child, actually, of Prince Vasak of Sunik And so she made the opposite trek to the women that we have seen before. She moved west into Anatolia rather than east into Sunni, where she came from. And she moved in order to marry Prince Gagik Bagratuni, who you see here, a man who by a cruel twist of fate became Gagik the First. He is, of course, the middle son, the one who was left over. His brother Simbat became king. His life should have been perfectly normal, pleasant, in a royal fashion. And it was not to be. Here he's shown presenting his church, Gaggashen, which he put up at Ani. And as you can see, the model of this church looks familiar. It's part of the repeated Armenian experimentation with round churches. And as in the case of Zvartnots, which is the example that we already looked at of this form, Gaggashen was equally unstable. It did not fare well, unfortunately. And it's interesting that he built it right around the same time that his wife began a building program. But two more things I should say before we get to hers. Of course, when she moved to join him, she lived in Ani, the capital city that the Bagratids chose when Bagaran was no longer central enough for the needs of their growing domains. Ani is famous as the city of 1,000 churches, whether they were freestanding churches or private chapels. It had a plethora of them. Ani was also the city of 100 to 200,000 inhabitants. A city as large in its day as Constantinople was. In terms of population, perhaps also when you count the suburbs in terms of extent. And it was the equal of the Islamic capital city of Baghdad. Fascinating in other respects as well. In addition to its above ground extent, its marvelous location above the river meant that it was able to also have an equally large subterranean city. Here's one of the entrances, or exits, I guess, depending on your point of view, to the subterranean city. And there are reports of people trundling carts along the streets of the subterranean city. And as you can see, it's not small. It possessed underground rooms, storage areas, residences. Terraces overlooking the river. Quite a spectacular thing. I believe Christina Moranci also has a lovely article on some of these cave structures, not underneath the city, but near it. Structures that were used as tombs, for example. And speaking of tombs, it's interesting that Kataranides' tomb was found near the Cathedral of Ani in 1893. In a book called In the Cemetery of Their Ancestors, a man named Manuk Haloyan described the first phase of these excavations. He says, a small chapel was found in a courtyard just to the east of the Mother Cathedral in Ani. It was uncovered, and inside it were found 2 tombs. The tombs had been rifled through by grave robbers, but there was a fully intact skeleton lying in repose, found in one of them. Its remains were identified as belonging to Queen Kataranide, the wife of Gagik I, and the patron of the cathedral. To the confusion of Mar and the other individuals present, a metal nail was found driven through her 2 feet in what can only be interpreted as an extreme demonstration of the Queen's piety by emulating the suffering that Christ had undergone. Reading that, the automatic question is, why? It is extreme. We have no idea, was she dead or alive when her feet were nailed? Was it she who requested that this happen? Or was it someone else? What is the story behind her bizarre burial? Well, we may have some thoughts on that. This is a family of Bagratid men, after all. Nothing personal to anyone in the audience. Bagratids were special in this regard. King Sambat I, one of the 2 about whom Khosravanush had been worried enough to build 2 churches for him and for her youngest son. Sambat began his reign wonderfully. He was known as Dia Zeragal. He was the universal ruler. He enjoyed prestige, unlimited resources, it seemed, was a great builder himself. Laid the foundation for a massive cathedral that would mark the city as his forever. And then something happened to him. We don't know what it was exactly. But the story is told of how at one point in his reign, he became very irascible. He was easily upset, became angry at the drop of a hat. And when news was brought to him that one of his storehouses had been set on fire by a mentally disturbed homeless man, apparently, he flew into an uncontrollable rage and had the poor man incinerated, and then had his corpse thrown outside the city. No one was allowed to bury it. The population was aghast. Such a thing had not been heard of. Things like that were not done. This was a human being, not a log. You have many storehouses. What is the problem with one of them being damaged? And people began to wonder about the king and to whisper perhaps something was going to happen to him in retaliation for this heinous misdeed. And it didn't end there. Sambat went on to marry his own niece. Something that certainly is not done canonically in the Armenian church, and normally not by anybody. And the king developed a disease. In addition to his obvious mental issues, he began to be pursued, as the historians say, by a sensation of burning His skin was inflamed. He felt that he was on fire. And people said, well, yeah, what do you expect? Just think what he did to that poor guy. This is divine punishment. We just heard about something relevant to this in another lecture yesterday, which is why we're smiling here, not because of the story.
Where do we read this? Which historian is this?
Yeah, I can get it for you.
Oh, wait.
It's a very interesting story. And eventually, as the king disintegrated further and further, he died.
Hmm.
But why? Why would he die after a relatively short period of suffering? Shouldn't he have lingered a little longer? He was not in that bad shape. And rumors began to fly around Ani that perhaps his brother had something to do with it. Perhaps Gagik had a hand in terminating his older brother's suffering and the danger into which it had led the kingdom. The rumors deepened when very shortly after the king's passing, just days after the king's passing, no sooner was he buried than Gagik took the throne. There was no mourning period in between. And there are allusions, nothing was ever proved. They actually exhumed somebody to see if there were signs that he had been harmed, and there were not, which didn't do anything to quell the rumors, but there it was. But Gagik himself would allude at several points in his reign to something that hung over him like a cloud. Was it guilt? Was it the burden of his brother's death? We don't know what it was. But whatever the secret was in the family following Sambat's death, whatever the relationships were between her children, it may have been enough for Kataranide to feel that building might not be sufficient to expiate the sins of her clan. And hence, she would wish to be buried with her feet nailed together in a final act of supplication to the deity, to forgive not her transgressions, which she seems not to have had any of, at least no noticeable ones, but those of her loved ones. We don't know, obviously. Here's a nice view from the subterranean city. I like this one. But it's interesting to see that when Sambat was dead, he left behind the foundation of a massive church, which he had intended to build. Here's its floor plan. And it's fascinating that Gagik did not choose to build this structure. He built Gaggashen instead. What was the reason why he did not wish to pursue his brother's plan? Was it cost? Probably not, because he did allow his wife to do it. Was it that he couldn't stand just the thought of his brother's death under strange circumstances, and so it was kind of like you just don't want to do it? We don't know, again. But when her brother-in-law had died and her husband had become king, it was Kataranide who took over this building project. Her brother-in-law's project to create a great and impressive cathedral fit for the capital of a flourishing world power kingdom. And she hired the famous architect Turdat, freshly returned from his glorious success restoring the dome of Hagia Sophia. in Constantinople. The big deal, of course, was that that dome is so massive and yet it has no interior support. How did he do it? His restoration was a tour de force of mathematical and engineering precision. And together, he and Kataranide created this gigantic basilical cathedral. It didn't have, well, no longer has, maybe it did have, an immense silver cross that surmounted that dome, as Sambat had intended. It also had, at one point, a gigantic crystal chandelier that he imported specifically for it from India before he died. And she made sure it got hung in the church. On this structure, we can see so many of the traditional Armenian elements of design. You see the same blind arches that you have on Haripsime. You see the massive stylobate platform, underneath it, the steps, almost going up to the top of the door. And considering the instability of this type of structure, it's absolutely miraculous that this church still stands. This is with no maintenance over many centuries. Now there's a little bit going on. But this is a reconstruction of it by the architect Toros Toromanyan. And you can see on the end of it, the little chapel that she had added to it for remains portion of the relics of Saint Haripsime that were brought to be housed at the cathedral. And on the front, in fact, all the way around this church, we see Khosrovanush's arches. Again, serving no actual purpose in terms of bolstering the structure, but increasing that vertical dimension. That's a little hard to grasp in a picture. But as you begin to approach the actual structure, you get an idea of the massive quality of this building. As you approach the door, the three windows, the opening of the door itself, almost keyhole shaped at this point in time. And for scale, a couple of humans. Just the pedestals, the bottoms of those columns are almost up to the level of their waist, maybe even the middle of their chest. The columns, the clusters of those columns, massive, and yet looking slender, almost delicate, betraying their actual strength. The space where the dome was a dome that's worthy of Turdat, actually. Now a little bit of scaffolding up there to try and make sure it doesn't fall in and we don't lose a tourist attraction and cause a ruckus. And the feeling one must have had walking into this space with the light, for a night service at least, glinting off all of that crystal. And off the decorations that we know covered at least parts of the wall. It must have been awesome. Awesome in a way not typically Armenian. The intimacy of the church is not there, certainly. But you can see the same intention as the soaring quality of Khosrow Manusha's church at Sanani. The altar apse has been whitewashed over, but as Professor Moranci has shown, it was fully frescoed. And she has been able to reconstruct, thanks to photographic technology, the subject matter of the frescoes and some of their outline. It's as if, even in a state of obliteration, this church speaks. You can only keep its voice silent for so long. It has a very Byzantine-like structure behind the altar. We'll see that again when we talk about frescoed churches in Armenia. Not only was her church exquisite, soaring, delicate in its strength on the inside, the same is true externally. Although the decorations are very refined.
And a brief note on the black and red roofs is that's common in this period
Yes,
already.
Absolutely, it's a decorative addition to the structure. Rather than make it all one color, this keeps the eye busier with it. And so you're more likely to notice things on the surface than you would be if it was all the same color. These designs are, by this time, how old? You'd think that they were made yesterday. And you can see that the layering of an archway, even in a small place like this, where very few people are going to see it up close, yet is very expressive of the motifs of creation. And the care taken in both planning, creating, and executing the workmanship within these useless arches is extraordinary. As for example, on this piece, which would certainly be above eye level. Yet the interlacing of the birds and the foliage. Does it really matter where it's placed as long as God will see it? And so not only was Kataranide's church built for her inexplicably stricken brother-in-law, the center of the Armenian Catholicosate for several generations. But even today, of all the buildings that once stood at Ani, it is hers. Her expression of faith, her expression of hope, her her prayer that dominates the desolate landscape where Ani no longer stands. Faith remains. Her statement about who she was, who her people were in relationship to God, what their expectations are of divine forgiveness for what have been perhaps unspeakable sins, still stands. And it's still true. So I thought we would have time for the church at Horamos, which is a man-built church, just to kind of bring it back to not be so totally focused on simply the women. But the fact is that the Bagratid structures are so many. And each one is more wonderful than the last. It's difficult to fit them all in. We could do a year just on Bagratid churches and not run out. So I think we'll leave it at this point. And we'll see.